need to buy somebody out of a mortgage, whether it's a divorce, inheritance, or splitting up with a partner, it could seem like a mess. But today I'm going to show you the best ways to handle it and save yourself a ton of stress. So you probably want to know what your options are, and I'm going to go through that. But I'm also going to go through some key financial moves you need to make sure it's fair for you and your partner, but also your bank accounts. I'm Justin Brown, mortgage pro and real estate investor, and I've been doing this a very long time. So here's exactly what you need to know. So let's jump into 3 of the most common options that come up with this. It's either a regular refinance, using a home equity line, or possibly assuming the mortgage. And I promise by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly which one is best for you, including whether you just need to sell the property. So let's start with refinancing. This is probably the most common way to do a buyout, but the cool part that most people don't realize is it's actually not considered a cash out refinance. Because when you do an actual cash out refinance, there's loan to value restrictions. You could typically only pull about 70 to 80% of your value out when you're doing this, and they come with much higher interest rates. But if you're doing a buyout, you could actually go as high as 95% of the home's value, take that cash out, and the bank doesn't consider it a cash out loan, and you get what's called a rate and term rate, which is better. But if it's a rental property you're doing this on, you're still going to be stuck at the 75 to 80% threshold. But either way, it's still going to be a better interest rate doing it this way. But a couple important things to know if this is even going to work for you is if you inherited the property, then you're good to go right off the bat. But if you just bought the property with a partner or your spouse, you will have to have owned it and both been on title for at least 12 months to not be considered a cash out when you're buying them out. But if you are going this route, here's where most people slip up. They forget that if you were to actually sell the property, you would have about 7 to 8% of that price in closing costs and realtor commissions. Things like realtor commissions, title fees, escrow fees, property taxes, all those things will eat up into your equity. So whenever I'm talking to somebody that's considering doing a buyout, they typically will look at what the home's worth, what they owe, and then they'll just split that difference 50-50 or however they want to split it up. So I always recommend taking 92% of what the home's worth, because if you were to sell it, again, you're going to have that 7 to 8% in fees that's going to come out of it anyways. So if you're doing it this way, I would still consider that. So my tip is when you are running the numbers, use 92% of the value when you're coming up with your buyout figures. Why? Because if you were to sell it, that's about the number you would get anyways. Now let's jump into a home equity line of credit. So if you have a really low interest rate on the mortgage that's on the property now, you might not want to touch that. You might want to start considering a home equity line of credit instead for that buyout. But the downside with the home equity line of credit is they do come with much higher interest rates, sometimes as high as 9, 10 to even 12% from what I've seen. So even though it's a great way to keep that low interest rate in place on your first mortgage, you still want to consider how much you need to pull out to buy them out and how much interest you're going to be paying on that. There's these things called a blended rate calculator where you could actually put in how much you owe on your first, what that interest rate is, how much you would be taking out on the HELOC, what that interest rate is, and it'll blend it together to let you know what overall interest you're paying on all that money. So if you look at your blended rate, you could then compare it to a regular refinance and see which one's going to save you the most money. Because if you have a 3% interest rate on the first, you get a quote from a lender to do a buyout and the rate's 5.5% and that looks super ugly. Well, maybe if you blended that 3% first and a 12% HELOC, the blended rate might be 6.5% or even higher. So you really need to look at that before you determine if a HELOC is going to be better because you have that lower interest rate on the first. So now let's talk about a loan assumption, because you might not have known this, but you could actually assume a mortgage if it's a VA or FHA loan, which means you could step into the existing loan, have the other person removed from it without having to go through any of that, which can be super well worth it if it's a low interest rate. And again, it's probably only going to be worth doing all that if you have a really low interest rate on that mortgage already. And typically when you're doing a buyout, the other party, if they are on that loan, wants to be completely removed from it because they don't want to be obligated on that debt or have it on their credit anymore. So a loan assumption will help make that happen as well. So if you're eligible for a loan assumption and you do it, that would remove them from the loan. And then you could pair that with the home equity line of credit to complete the buyout portion. And last, obviously, you could just sell the property and split the profits. But just remember, those closing costs are still going to bite into your final amount. Now, this is usually the last resort, but remember, if those numbers from the other options don't work for you, then this is another way to just have a clean break and move on. So if you have any more questions or want to know what your new mortgage payment would be after a buyout or want to look at some different options, just shoot me an email. It'll be in the captions below. And don't forget to hit that like and subscribe to get more tips on making real estate real for you.